to jump over things. I have a big clock in front of me, Michelle, so that we will move fast. Two propositions to organize this talk. One of them is to think about this period, and I think all the preceding talks contained that proposition in them, even though not explicated. To think of this period as a time when stabilized meanings have become unstable. I don't think that meanings are permanently stable, but they acquire a certain kind of stability with a certain kind of temporality. I think today there's a lot of destabilizing, and I thought that Elisa, in fact, ended very beautifully also on that tone. The second one is that master categories, which are super stabilized meanings, and which are meanings that explain a lot. It's not for anything that they are master categories. They also produce an enormous penumbra around themselves. And we need to do our theoretical, our empirical, our discoveries, very importantly, I think, today, in that penumbra of master categories. Now, in terms of my own practice, I am a bit idiosyncratic, I'm a bit transversal. The global and the national clearly are two massive master categories which I engage. And it seems to me that they're beginning to suffer from a certain kind of fatigue. They explain a lot. The question is, what happens in the penumbra of their powerful explanations? Now, there are always risks entailed in stepping away from master categories and moving into that penumbra. I chose three conditions: territory, authority, rights, which are complex constructions. They are not states of nature. They are all made. In that sense, they are profoundly sociological. They exist in all complex organizational forms, whether tribal or nomadic societies, organized religions, multinational corporations, and of course, more complex types of state formations. So for me, using these three categories is a way of going beyond the power of the national to explain a lot and the power of the global to explain a lot. It is not rejecting them. Doing that also means recovering the category of making. The nation state was made, we all know that. But in many of the categories that we use, especially in sociology, we sort of have lost that. Now, let me just give you, I'm going to start running now. Let me give you an illustration of making. This is a very self-evident, very simple explanation, and it's just a way of nailing down one instance of what I mean. And that is, if you look at the current period and you take the category immigrant, here I just focus on immigrant spaces. Each of these, they're all familiar, each of these is an assemblage of bits and pieces of territory, authority, and rights. They vary enormously between the one at the top, the professionals, etc., that basically the WTO regime matters there, special visas issued by states matter there. They're very different from family dependence. Each one of the subjects that emerges out of this space has different claims on territory, on authority, and on rights. So that is just, again, there's something about the immigrant subject which we have constructed as distinct, and hence it also becomes a heuristic subject, and this is one way of disaggregating it. Second quick illustration, this notion of destabilizing master categories at a time when instability in the reality prevails. And our categories often are still a bit hanging in there, like family, for instance, or the nuclear family. Now here, I'm looking at, I want to take the category remittances, since we are with the subject of immigration. Remittances actually starts, of course, with a little innocent word, remit, to send money or something. Today, when you say remittances among immigration scholars, it means something charged with meaning. It is the money sent by poorer immigrants back to their poorer countries. And immigration specialists, I'm often in those kinds of situations, tend to look at the question of remittances from a state-centric angle. They look at the country they are studying and the immigrants from poorer countries that are there and where they send their remittances. If you take a global perspective, and I hope you can see the figures, what you see is that this is the top 20 remittance recipient countries. Now what you see is that in the top 10 are 5 very rich countries. That unsettles, again, this is a bit of an elementary example clearly, but that unsettles the category remittances as it has circulated recently. And clearly, when you take this global angle, you also pick up on the professionals, of course, circulating. Now I'm not going to do this now. The income structure, this was mentioned already earlier before too. I want to show you 2 graphs. And I would argue that one way of understanding these, especially today's extremes in inequality, is that we need to move away from just the national. Those global professionals are partly also feeding this type of distribution. Now here, I love this graph. Let's see if this is a pointer. You can see if it's the income share of the top 10%, 1917 to 2005. The 2 extremes, 45% in the earlier period, moving into 45% of national income for the top 10% also in the second period. The flat moment there are the adorable Keynesian decades. And you can see that even though the top 10% still was rather grabby, they got much less, like 32% only. Poor thingies. Now, I just got these figures. These are the latest sort of figures. I can give you the sources, or we can leave that. Now, if you look this is the United States, of course, always a slightly extreme zone for these kinds of things. But if you look at, this is the percent change in after-tax income, 1979 to 2007. The top 1% increased by 281%. This is just income. This doesn't include all the other things. The highest fifth actually did pretty well. Those are also a whole bunch of the new professionals, the new really rich middle classes that you also have in China, and you also have in India, and you have in Brazil, and you have throughout. 95%. The middle fifth, the nice, old, modest middle class, the ideal that we have when we say the middle class, by 25% over a period of 30 years. The lowest fifth, 16%. Now, I want to put it as a question, but can we posit that when you have these types of patterns in income inequality, and we know this is an underrepresentation of the inequality, given all the other sources of income, the higher up you go, does the category of the national help us, or are we also talking here, like with the immigrant, that what we're seeing is a disaggregating of what once could be conceived of as a whole, at least for a while, as in the Keynesian period, and that we are dealing with a new arrangement? We need new categories for this. Now, final quick point that I want to get at is one particular instance of disassembling of sort of the nation-state notion of territory, authority, and rights. And this is based on some research that I'm doing, a little book that is called Expulsions. And I just want to look, and this is again, I repeat, one instance. There are many others. And I want to look at something that a bit more poetically we might say, describe as la terre nomade, the fact that land is actually nomadic. But it is nomadic in the sense that it moves from one institutional setting to another. And so this repositioning, on the one hand, a more familiar issue, the repositioning of territory and the global division of functions. Secondly, a bit more complex, I think, a bit more elusive for sociology perhaps, is the making of alternative jurisdictions, going beyond older forms of extraterritoriality. And the third, the making of novel, parallel geopolitical circuits, besides the dominant geopolitical circuit that is still the supranational system, the interstate system. Now, I will elaborate these three rather perhaps obscure propositions as I move. But the main point that I want to focus on is something that was already brought up today, are all this vast amount of buying of land in mostly poor countries. The second point here, which I think is extremely important, the land, for reasons I will elaborate in a minute, becomes more valuable than many of the possible activities on that land, especially traditional economies, and then the people. It means the active making of a surplus population. Surplus population is one of those categories that has a neutrality attached to it. In fact, what we see here is a profound process of actively making a surplus population. And final point, in a way, these are novel assemblages of territorial authority rights. I should say that this is a real footnote now, that when I came up with this title, TAR, I liked that because I wanted to recover materiality at a time when everybody talks about deterritorialization. My husband, who is a fine, astute Richard Sennett, said, why didn't you call it authority, rights, and territory? Then you have art, which is a nice idea. And my punkish friend said, why not rat, which I think would have been the best. Now, here are some of the figures. And I'm studying 95 contracts. There are many more, but they're all of the recent 2 years. And I'm looking at them under a proposition that I call, I've done the same for global high finance, the using enormously complex instruments that have to be made. So you have creative classes, you have all, to produce elementary brutalities. So here, coming back to the prior slide, the shift, the first one here, the repositioning of territory, the shift of territory from a complex condition to just land, if you want, on the global market. Now, South Korea, and now here, I want to use the first one to illustrate the geopolitics. South Korea is a signatory of the International Criminal Court. So is Sweden. We are in Sweden. Both of these countries have bought land in Sudan. The leader of Sudan, as you know, is under an arrest warrant of the ICC. This is one example, and again, just one example of an alternative geopolitics. When you look at these contracts in detail, you see a proliferation of these other kinds of geopolitics. What I like to mention about the Ethiopian case is that we, the taxpayers of the world, via the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, sent 100 million to feed the poor of Ethiopia, and also that the people in Ethiopia, the poor, they also like wheat, barley, and rice. I actually love bringing in those very concrete terms in this chat here. Now, we all know about China, and here what I want to point out, also invoking the question of the environment, is that the expulsion that this level of acquisition produces is not just of people, but it is also of very complex and rich faunas and floras. This can last for 30 years, then the land is dead, and then one can go buy it somewhere else. The land will recover, but it will take a bit. I have one of the exercises that I do in my research is to create global circuits on which are located all the dead waters and the dead lands actively made by our kind of economic system. You can see that I have a bit of a black humor in my research. But now here's another one, Russia and Ukraine. It is no simple matter for these post-Soviet states to sell land to other states. You understand that what we're talking about here largely is one state buying land from another state. So there are enormous complications. Here there are just hints. You have to create new companies, you have to float, etc., etc. And again, it's sort of interesting. As you know, South Korea is actively buying land in a lot of places. So are the financial services firms, by the way. And it's not that they are about to become farmers. That is definitely not. But they can't go wrong buying land. And here I give the 3 reasons. This shift that I'm talking about, where terrain is time 1 encompassed in a complex institutional framing that we can call territory, which comes with a presumption of a rights-bearing, rights-carrying subject, the citizen, the resident, a complex organization called the state that can respond to claims, that can grant rights, etc. The shift of terrain out of that setting and into an institutional frame where it just is earth is, to me, a form of enormously complex instruments being produced to generate very elementary brutality. It is really a shift from complexity to brutality. Now, I am not enamored with national states, but I do think that these kinds of shifts, which are happening also in other domains, are extremely significant. Now, there are 3 reasons why land, earth. One is rare earth. You know, the 56 elements in the periodic table that Mendeleev already had detected, but he didn't know what they could be useful for. Now we know the electronic revolution, but also the green revolution. Many of these rare earths are in trace form all over. But, you know, in certain settings more than in others. But it does mean that earth itself, earth, becomes valuable because they're everywhere. The second reason is water, you know, our blue gold, etc. Coca-Cola just bought 2 million hectares in South America just for water. If you take a Google map, you know, there are good military satellite technology. You only see rock, basically, but of course, great water. Great water, the blue gold of our modernity. And the third one is for agriculture. That's probably the best known one, and biofuels, you know, that kind of stuff. But anyhow, the sort of the powerful logic that I'm getting at here is that the search for earth does disassemble that older assemblage of territory, authority, and rights that is the nation state. Now, here's a final instance of some of the innovations that are happening. So Pakistan is offering 500,000 hectares of land to Gulf investors with the promise of a security force of 100,000 to protect the land. This is truly an innovation compared with the other contracts I've looked at. Now, who is the force of 100,000? Chances are they're military or some version of that, paid by the taxpayers. Whom are they protecting the land from? Mostly Pakistani farmers who would also like to have that land. So here again, you have sort of a complex arrangement. This is a complex contract, which actually produces some rather elementary brutalities. And I have asked myself, I want to end on this note. There is no conclusion to this talk, I think. I'm running out of time. That is the subprime mortgage crisis, you know, which has expulsed like 30 million people, basically. Is that sort of also an indication of this expulsion where complex terrain is reduced to, right now, it's just built up terrain in many cases. But that's just playing around. But however, if you look at some of these figures, I don't know, if you look at 205 here, you look at by race, this is New York City. We have these data for all kinds of cities in the U.S. The figures that you're looking at, they all basically lost their homes. Now, I'm not going to explain the mechanism, which is this distorted version of the original concept of subprime mortgage. But you can see that blacks, 47%, Hispanics, 39%. These are processes that actively alter these segments, these groups, I use the notion of an active making of surplus populations in the case of these expulsions from land. This is another version of an active making of some version of, again, of a surplus population, of something along those lines. These, for me, are trends that are happening, and there are many, many more, that deserve to be captured in categories, and that also actively destabilize existing categories of analyses. To me, it's the beginning of a story, so I will happily say that there is no conclusion. Thank you very much.